And then we have the Joseph narrative. That is the preservation of the seed during their Egyptian sojourn. The seed are preserved, but Israel is in the wrong place. They're in Egypt, and the worldwide blessing is not there. We ought to notice Judah, the tribe of Judah, is the means by which the promise of the king will be fulfilled. We see this in Genesis 38 and then Genesis 49. The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belong to him. So the promise of offspring will be fulfilled through a king. A king is coming. So, right, I'm arguing for kingdom through covenant. We see here that kingly theme. You might expect that king that is coming to be from Joseph. Yet surprisingly, it's from Judah. I actually think there's a rationale in the story because Reuben is excluded because he had sex with Jacob's concubine. Simeon and Levi are excluded because of their sin, and then Judah's next in line. And despite what Judah did in Genesis 38, he is not excluded. He's the next one in line, and he becomes the heir. So that's all I want to say about Genesis. We won't do every book so slowly, but Genesis is such a foundational and important book for everything. Anything you want to say? Questions, comments?
Yeah, so there's this line from the dominion Adam's given in the garden. Possibly the promise of the seed in Genesis 3:15, government in Genesis 9, and the king's promise to Abraham. Is that a continuous line pointing towards the kingdom, or are those related in a different way? What are your thoughts?
Well, so you had a question about Noah's covenant. Say that again. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me.
I just see a chain of just a bunch of references to authority being given to man, possibly through the covenant, because of dominion in Genesis 1 and 2 in the garden.
Yeah.
Government to restrain sin in Genesis 9 in the Noahic Covenant. There's also a government given to man. And then also the promise of kings later in Abraham. Are those related, or should I think of those as separate, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an excellent question. I mean, I don't think that in Genesis there's a strong connection between the Noahic rule and the promise. I mean, all those others are clearly, there's a genetic, organic relationship. But maybe in terms of the whole canon, that's a legitimate reading. You see what I'm saying? Maybe that works. I don't think Genesis itself emphasizes that, and I'm trying to think, is there anywhere else where that's kind of picked up in terms of Noahic, the Noahic Covenant? Perhaps. That'd be an interesting paper to write. You know? I mean, I just haven't thought about that, but maybe, but at least I don't think it's a direct argument. But maybe there's something there. That'd be an interesting argument to pursue. I thought I saw another hand, yeah.
So you said they killed off the Shechemites so that there wouldn't be intermarriage, and yet the Canaanite wife comes in to carry on the line.
Yeah.
How is that different?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the difference is, in terms of the whole narrative, it's a whole tribal group. It's one person. Clearly, the line when Judah goes outside, I mean, God's sovereignty, right? He works in surprising ways. But on the other hand, if there's a whole tribe that mixes in, it'll corrupt the seed. I mean, sort of like you think of Ezra. They have to divorce. They have to divorce those who are married outside of Israel. Well, I mean, you have other examples of it, right? I mean, Rahab. So perhaps it's the number of people. That's my best attempt. Yeah.
I was trying to understand. You mentioned Simeon and Levi's brothers who were, I think the word used, were excluded from being the ones who passed down the promise. So I was trying to understand that in light of, like Jacob and Esau, Paul talking about before they did anything good or bad, the purposes of election standing, he chose the one over the other. So how do they exclude when it seems like there's, that choosing? I guess how are you using that, the word exclude there? When it seems like there's a choosing that takes place.
Well, yeah, and
or like it's just revealing.
No, I mean, I think they're excluded. But of course, they're not excluded from the promise. They're excluded from an allotment in the land. But then, I mean, actually, you asked a larger question, which I'm probably going to skip. But we'll come back to it. But later, Levi is rewarded because in chapters 32 through 34, Levi participates, right, in the killing of the fellow Israelites who sinned at the golden calf, and they're rewarded with the priesthood. So it's sort of reversed, so then their obedience is rewarded. But we're actually not talking about salvation here so much as, hey, a place in the land, a particular place for their tribe. So it isn't, at least in...
So when you said excluded earlier, you're talking about in regards to the land.
To the allotment of the land.
Okay, sorry.
So there wasn't a special allotment in the land for Simeon and Levi.
Okay,
But they're not excluded from Israel. I'm not arguing that.
No, yeah, I thought you were saying they were excluded from being the ones who passed down the blessing of the...
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm not saying that. Yeah, good. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe I missed it. Did you, or can you clarify the reasons for why you covenant with Adam?
Yeah, I've written a little book called Covenant, where I defend that view. It's a very small little book. It's only like 33,000 words that I just did for Crossway. It came out recently. Of course, there's debate on whether there's a covenant with Adam, but one of the arguments I would use is those parallels with the covenant with Noah, which I did go over, though I think those are significant. And what we have with Noah is a covenant, so I think retrospectively we have a covenant with Adam. I think a covenant is, I think he's given a stipulation. I think there are stipulations in covenants and curses and blessings if you keep those stipulations. And so I think that's an indication of a covenant. This verse is very debated, but Hebrews, I don't know what I'm thinking in my mind. But they, like Adam, have violated the covenant. Now, some people say that's a place name, right? Because it says, there they have betrayed me. So some people take Adam there to be a place name. But the only reference to Adam, I don't remember the exact reference, but the only reference to Adam as a place name is in Joshua. And where it is a place name, it's a positive thing. There is no canonical example of them betraying the Lord at Adam. So I think this verse, the most natural way of reading this is that you have a reference to Adam violating the covenant in the garden. Another argument I'd use, there is no reference to the word covenant in 2 Samuel 7. The word covenant is not used when a covenant is made with David, but later they use the word covenant to describe it. So you don't have to have the word covenant for there to be a covenant. So those are some of the reasons. Yeah. Not everybody, that's a very contested issue, whether there's a covenant. Another argument I'd use, I think, now it depends on your view of Romans 5, but I think there's a covenantal relationship in Romans 5:12 through 19 between Adam and Christ. You either belong to Adam or Christ, and I think that's covenantal. I mean, Shedd holds the seminal view. Do you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these things? Now, I have great respect for Shedd. Shedd's kind of person who's argued for this, but I think the seminal view only makes sense if you hold a covenantal view. There's no meaningful sense in which we sinned in Adam in which we're conscious. So I feel like the seminal view produces nothing of any help. The only way I think really to explain the relationship between Adam and Christ is covenantal, I'd argue. So feel free you can disagree with me on that, that's fine.
Earlier you mentioned the Genesis 6 with the corruption of the daughters of
Yeah.
And you just mentioned Shechem, the Shechemites and the intermarriage. A.W. Pink in Gleanings in Genesis kind of detailed a little bit of what he thought was Satan's efforts to thwart the revealed will of God, going back to Genesis 3:15. Has that influenced your
I don't know, Pink. I've never read that book. I've read very little of Pink.
He mentions that when it was revealed that it would be through Abraham. Of course, we have they go down into Egypt, and the males are being thrown into the river by Pharaoh, and he's going to come through the tribe of Judah, divided kingdom. Judah's in the minority. You get 10 tribes against 2. It's going to come through Bethlehem. Of course, you got the death of the children 2 years old and younger. It just seems that A.W. Pink thought that as God was revealing more and more through Scripture about the line of Christ, that there was a very demonic, evil influence to try to either corrupt the line or to destroy the line. Through David, Saul's trying to basically kill his own son-in-law. And then right up until Christ is revealed, there's the temptation of Christ, and then of course even the Pharisees seeking to kill Christ. Just seems like every step of the road, Satan is trying to destroy.
I think that's. I mean, of course, I haven't read that and all the particulars, but that sounds right to me. I'm arguing along the same lines. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Well, I gotta go a little faster, right? But we're gonna do that. So let's talk about Exodus a little bit. We'll take a break, maybe in 15 minutes or so. When you open the book of Exodus, what's happening? Babies. Lots of babies. What's that? Promises being fulfilled. And really, just as this brother just said, Pharaoh is the offspring of the serpent. What does he want to do? He wants to kill the babies, right? Pharaoh in Ezekiel is called a dragon or Rahab. But, the monsters, they're demonic. The dragon is a demonic dragon, Revelation 12. So Pharaoh's the offspring of the serpent, isn't he? Israel's God's son. Israel's God's firstborn. And the Lord will kill the firstborn of Egypt. So you see the battle of the seeds, right? Who's the Lord going to kill? The offspring of the serpent. And Israel is the son of God. The Lord liberates Israel at the Exodus and the plagues, so that the Exodus is redemption, isn't it? The Exodus is the language of redemption in the New Testament is picked up from the Exodus, and we have an example there of typology, don't we? We have typology with the redemption from Exodus becoming a pattern, correspondence to what God now does in Jesus Christ. Hopefully we'll return to that again. So what a fascinating story. We could look at some of the details, but just to be reminded of Moses as the deliverer of God's people is weak. And that's a very encouraging story for all of us to think about in ministry. Honestly, if you think of yourself, I don't know any of you, but if you think of yourself, honestly, look at yourself before God and you think, you know what, I can do this. I'm gifted. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about you. I'm very worried about you. Because God uses the weak. God uses the humble. It's a very dangerous thing to study, isn't it? There's a great thing called intellectual arrogance. Think, oh, I'm very gifted, I'm smart, I know theology. Those are all good things, aren't they? They're wonderful things to know the truth. But we're weak. We are weak. We're children. Moses was great at the end of the day because Moses was humble. And there's lots of people who are smart out there, but it's dangerous if you think I'm adequate. I've got what it takes. I'm bright. I'm brilliant. Honestly, I've met some seminary students like that, and usually it doesn't end well. So, but if you feel inadequate, hey, that's how Moses felt. Was there sin in Moses' inadequacy? Is there pride in it? Yeah, there's sin in it. But it was a good place to be. It was a good place to be. So let's remind ourselves of that we need to remind ourselves that we're weak and God is great. God reveals himself here as the covenant-keeping God I am. We could talk a lot about that, but I think that's a covenant formula. Promises to free his people from Egypt. A very interesting story along the way, very puzzling story in some ways, where Yahweh threatens to kill Moses on the way, but it's because Moses is going to be the deliverer of the people, and he hasn't kept the covenant sign with his own family. He hasn't circumcised his own children, right? Probably because of Zipporah. It was probably a cultural thing, as much as we can tell. Why does she do it and throw the foreskin at his feet? Probably she's been resisting. And Moses said we need to circumcise, and she's like, we're not going to do that. But the covenant mediator can't be a covenant transgressor, right? So we see the plagues, the Lord delivers his people. Pharaoh starts by asking, right, this is great, who is the Lord? By the end of the story, he knows. Who's the Lord? There's lots of gods out there. But we see hints in the narrative, right? He'll know that there's no one like the Lord our God. Pharaoh's called upon to fear the Lord, isn't he? Paul picks up, what an important text. Paul picks up Exodus 9. Moses says to Pharaoh, now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. However, I've let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. So, Pharaoh's the most powerful person in the world, but God says, you're a little fly to me. I could have flicked you right off. But I'll tell you why I let you live. So, because I'm proclaiming my name through you, through the plagues, right? The great judgment, through the great deliverance from Egypt that Israel is experiencing. It magnifies God's name. So, that's really encouraging to us, isn't it? To think that way. We think of, you look at the Middle East, where there's very few Christians, and in other places, and think, is God in control? God's working his purposes out. God's working his purposes out in Iran right now, isn't he? Some amazing way. A lot of people are becoming Christians, as you probably know, in Iran. God's working. God, and sometimes that means allowing evil leaders to continue in their power for some time. So, just an encouraging word on God's sovereignty. God is king. Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and the Lord hardened his heart. That's a huge issue. I would argue, fundamentally, God hardened his heart. I agree with Greg Beale's interpretation of this passage. I don't know if you've seen his article years ago in Trinity Journal. Fundamentally, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it's also true that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But God was sovereign over Pharaoh's heart. He hardened his heart. Pharaoh is not exempt from guilt, even though God hardened his heart. The biblical narrative The biblical narrative holds these things together, doesn't it? God is sovereign, and yet the evil that Pharaoh does, he's accountable for that evil. Now, we're not attempting to give in this class, now which psalm is it in? I may not be able to find this right off. We're not attempting to give in this class a philosophical resolution to the problem of evil. But the Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them more numerous than their foes. This is talking about in Egypt. And the hearts of the Egyptians, he turned to hate his people. God did that. God did that. But their hatred of his people is sin. At the same time, I know I have a lot of friends who read that text who are minning and say, well, if that's true, if God turned their hearts to hate him, then they can't be accountable. Then they're puppets. But of course, that's not what the text is saying. That's what the psalmist is saying. God was sovereign over what was happening in the decisions they made. Even turned their hearts to hate them, and yet God is not the author of their evil in a particular sense, is he? Finally. So that's a fascinating theme to see as we think about biblical theology. Okay. We see the Passover theme, which anticipates Christ's death. 1 Corinthians 5. Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed. Removed the leaven. The leaven for Paul is evil, isn't it? It points to removing evil from your life. There's a great deliverance. Remove evil from your life. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. So the Passover sacrifice is fulfilled in the cross of Jesus Christ. Some of this stuff I'm going to skip. You're reading my book as well. Exodus 19 through 24, the Mosaic Covenant, similar to the suzerain vassal treaties in some ways of that day. You see God as a covenant Lord. I just want to say a couple things about this covenant that I want to hit on, that I talk about in the book as well. But one of the things I want to say is it's wrong to say that's a legalistic covenant. Some people say, well, that was a legalistic covenant. The earliest dispensationalists, no dispensationalist says this today, but in the original Schofield Bible says that when God gives the stipulations of the covenant, that Israel should have said no. When instead of saying all the words of this law we will do, that the Israelites should have said, no, we can't do the law, and we're not agreeing. Well, I'll tell you one thing, that is like a terrible, horrible misreading of the text, because the Lord would have been very angry if they said no. Here's my covenant. No, thank you. We don't want to do that. No, it's not a legalistic covenant because God elected them to be his people, right? Deuteronomy 7. He loved them. That's a great passage. He loved them because he loved them. Why does the Lord love them? He loved them because he loved them. Do you know the little jingle? How odd of God to choose the Jews. You heard that rhyme? Indeed. How odd of God to choose the Jews. How odd of God to choose anybody. If he chose the people, why did he choose the Jews? Well, why did he choose you? Why does he choose anyone? I mean, why does he love them? He loves them because he loves them. So God gave them the law after he delivered them from Egypt, didn't he? So he saved them and delivered them. So it's not a legalistic covenant. Israel's to be a kingdom of priests. They're to be a blessing to the world. They're to be a new Adam in the Garden of Canaan, right? As priest kings. Well, we see the Mosaic Covenant as complex because you also see the thunder and lightning in Exodus 19. What do you think of when you see Exodus 19? What do you think of in the New Testament, the thunder and lightning? Somebody tell me. What passage? What passage do you think of in the New Testament? Hebrews 12, absolutely. Hebrews 12. In Hebrews 12, he contrasts that with the new covenant, doesn't he? So the covenant is gracious, but it's also conditional. Israel must keep the covenant stipulations. They must do what God has commanded to enjoy fellowship with him. The Sabbath is the covenant sign. It's the heart of the covenant, symbolizing Israel's rest and enjoyment. And then the Ten Commandments. I just want to say a word about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are about God being supreme in our lives, right? No other gods. God's first. God's first in our life above all else, above anything else. Gerhard von Rad, I love this quote, "The intolerant claim for exclusive worship is something unique in the history of religion." Isn't that great? Still bothers people today, doesn't it? We believe in that exclusivity. The first commandment and the 10th commandment, they're the same commandment, right? You shall have no other gods before me. What you covet is your God. Paul tells us that, doesn't he? What you desire, if you desire someone else's wife, someone else's reputation, someone else's house, that's your God, finally. That's what you're worshiping. And that flows into all the commandments. So if you're stealing, you're worshiping what? Security, material prosperity. You're desiring something more than God. If you're committing sexual sin, committing adultery, you're worshiping what? Physical pleasure, whatever it is. Every one of the commandments is informed by the first and the 10th commandment, every time. So the commandments have a depth to them, don't they? They're not just mere external rules. They reveal whether God is Lord in one's heart.